Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait just a few minutes to let everyone join in. Thank you for joining us this morning. Good morning. Okay. We'll give it about 30 more seconds and we'll get started with this very interesting and well-anticipated talk, APAT talk. Good morning. I'm Arnika Dawkins, chair of the APAT Education Committee, presenter of APAT Talks. APAT Talks brings together prominent curators, artists, collectors, and writers to discuss thought-provoking ideas, new trends, and unique processes involved in the medium of photography. APAT Talks start conversations that lead to understanding, inspiration, and action. On behalf of the members of APAT, welcome to today's talk, The African American Experience from the Beginning of the Civil War to 1900, retelling stories in photography about the Black Civil War soldier. Our speakers today are Dr. Deborah Willis, an artist, author, and curator. Her art and pioneering research has focused on cultural histories, envisioning the Black body, women, and gender. She is a celebrated photographer and an acclaimed historian of photography, MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow, and university professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. Dr. Willis received the NAACP Image Award in 2014 for her co-authored book, Envisioning Emancipation, Black Americans and the End of Slavery, and in 2015 for the documentary Through a Lens Darkly, inspired by her book, Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the Present. Joining Dr. Willis today is Dr. Makeda Bess, who is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography at the Harvard Art Museums, where she oversees the museum's photography collections. Her scholarly interests focused on the 19th century and 20th century American photography, with a special interest in photojournalism, documentary, war photography, and text and image works. We look forward to an exciting and informative talk with our distinguished speakers today. I want to thank you for joining us. Feel free to engage with our speakers by utilizing the chat box. We will also have a Q&A at the end of the discussion. And with no further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers. First, Dr. Deborah Willis and Dr. Makeda Bess.
Hello, hi, thank you for a wonderful introduction. Really happy to be here, as well as to share this time with Makeda Bess, whose work I respect and have enjoyed over time. I am curious about, let's see, there's signed here. Let's see. I'd like to begin by saying that I'm going to share work from my book, The Black Civil War Soldier, and just to share work that's recently found in the archives and talk about the importance of the archive. I am going to, let me start with this part to say, thank you. Okay, let's go back one. Apologies with this first slide, and just to hang out. Okay. So the idea of retelling a story about the 19th century has excited me for a long time, and just to think about how do we tell stories based on the archive, based on the archives that have been hidden or unprocessed, and how to talk through the archives of the 19th century through masculinity and freedom, but also through the idea of how photographers were central in telling the story. So the idea of memory was an important aspect for me, and how do we think about public memory through the photographic archive. And starting with this cover of the book, which is published by NYU Press, it's an image by a man by the name of Nimrod Burke. He is holding a pistol to his chest. He is using the idea of freedom with the concept of what it meant for a Black man to join the war during this time. Also on the right, an image of how the photographers were in collaboration with the idea of freedom. When we think about citizenship and the conflict of citizenship of Black people during this time period, we know many Blacks were enslaved, but they also knew the terms of humanism and the idea of freedom is found in posing for the photograph. And the photographer also uses the backdrop with the American flag, red, white, and blue. The idea of land and storytelling is a central way of looking at these images. With Nimrod Burke, we see a family image that's in the family collection. So when we think about the public image of Nimrod Burke, which is on the cover of this image, of the book rather, and then the private image that his great-great-great-grandson published in an article that he produced about his grandfather. And we see that he was born in 1836, enslaved in Virginia, and that he lived over a period of time and fought in on the Company F 23rd Regiment. So looking at the range of photographs and thinking about the stories that many of the photographers as well as the subjects experienced, and one specifically, Frederick Douglass, he says it was someone else wrote, it was the Civil War that inspired Douglass to write and speak on photography. Like many Americans, he believed that photographs and pictures greatly contributed to secession and a war over slavery. So when he wrote, once you let the Black man get upon his person the brass letter US, let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth or under earth which can deny that he can earn the right to citizenship in the United States. So this is a conversation that has circulated over time when we look at images and think about the importance of the battle during that time when Black men were allowed to join the Civil War. Frederick Douglass also created broadsides to encourage Black men to join the fight. And here is one to colored men, the 54th Regiment, and here's a young man posing. Carrie Mae Weems is another central figure for me as we think about the contemporary artists who are looking at the past and 19th century images. She writes, I looked and looked to see what so terrified you. The terrifying not only of the aspect of denying beauty, but denying citizenship and humanity throughout the 19th century through slavery. Images in the archives that I think is central in telling the story is also to look at how images where Black people lived on the quarters in South Carolina and in Virginia. And again, another image of a portrait of a Civil War soldier, Richard Etheridge, who fought alongside his captain and Orrin Hendricks. And they had an exchange after the war where they shared letters and also talked about the experience of their battles together. And another aspect of the archive, which I want to focus on in this talk, is the importance of public archives, such as the National Archives, the pension records, and the pension records with the image of Henry Brewster, which was sent by his wife, Susan Brewster, to try to get his pension. And his wife in 1905, after his death, sent her only photograph. She says, I'm sending my only photograph of my husband, and also documented his service in the war, also his injuries. And so with that in mind, she had hoped to receive his pension. And over time, she had to produce document upon document upon document and never received the pension and never received the photograph. The photograph was never returned. One of the other projects that I worked on before was Envisioning Emancipation with Barbara Krauthammer. And we found this image at the American History Museum at the Smithsonian of a washerwoman. And again, as we think about citizenship, we see how the photographer also in collaboration with the subjects that they photograph. Here again, the American flag is enhanced with the paintings, red, white, and blue, the colors, and the US brass button. So I imagine, and we talked about this, that a soldier, in appreciation of her working with him or with the company troop, in terms of how the importance of washerwomen, because so many men died of dysentery or unhealthy conditions because of war, and not only the battles, but also washerwomen served as confidants and also helped to teach reading, but also with healthcare. And so we see this as a celebration of a woman who received this honor. Unidentified images of family members. The one on the right was just recently identified. And we see this is in Cecil County, Maryland, where a man takes his family to be photographed. And we know that through the archives and through the images that we found over time, that many men who died in war or in illness, they were found with photographs, holding on to family photographs or family photographs in their pockets. Another way that I wanted to approach my research is the idea of text and letters that were sent, that were published also in newspapers. But this is a letter that was sent by a woman by the name of Martha to her husband. And she writes, "I received your last letter, your kind letter in 1863, a few days ago." This is not Martha on the left, but this is from a collection that is part of the book. And here we see, again, as I think about the photographer, that he enhances the image with gold leaf. So we see the aspect of Black love in the 19th century in these images, which is rarely discussed, where we see a romantic relationship. We also see reading the letter of community relationship with the other mothers and family members who she describes in the letter. The images of men leaving in Ohio, but also the aspect of free military school in Philadelphia for colored troops. This image to me is a central image. I love this image. It's a Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. Men are mingling outside, but also because it's a long exposure, some are, it's faded. But we see that there's an opportunity for Black troops to join the war, but also take lessons, take classes in math and English and other humanities. But this is an opportunity where we see the commitment where Black men would move to Philadelphia who were free and enslaved, who escaped slavery, would study and prepare for war. And this is an image of Camp William Penn where 10,000 men were part of the troop. Another image that's central is an image in terms of creating the aspect of why this is an important story, why archives are central. And this is an image of a woman by the name of Dolly, who's in the Manicault collection at the University of North Carolina, but she was also enslaved by Louis Manicault. He places a wanted ad. We rarely see a photograph on a, quote, runaway or a self-emancipated person. And it says, ran away from the corner of Jackson and Broad Street in Augusta, Georgia, a woman, Dolly, and quotes under her name, whose likeness is seen here. He describes her as 30 years of age, not healthy, light complexion, but rather good looking. And so we begin to see this sense of betrayal where he says that she was enticed off by some white man, possibly a Union soldier, possibly a light-skinned lover, but we see how Black people were self-emancipating at this time period, and how photography was used to promote this image to identify someone who left slavery. Portrait of Susie King Taylor in 1902. Susie King Taylor was another woman, and I felt that the aspect of women, their stories were missing from the narrative of this experience. And Susie King Taylor was also enslaved, and she worked in South Carolina. She taught some of the men how to read and to write, to prepare them when they were paid to sign their names, and not just an X at the payment depot. And here we see men gathered in this seriograph of the 10th Army Corps, and many of them who escaped slavery, and we see this sense of commitment to freedom. Another image that is central for me as a way to think about how important it is to find photographs that connect with the narrative. This is not a photograph of Garland White, but it's an image to me that illustrates a soldier who goes to a photographic studio. It poses for a camera, for the photographer. But the narrative of this is a woman who was enslaved, who searched for her son for over 20 years. And she says, she questions a soldier who enters Richmond, Virginia, and she says he was a chaplain. She asked his name. She asked who about his mother. He asked her name. We end up through a number of exchanges, and the final exchange, she said, "This is your mother, Garland, who you're now talking to, who has spent 20 years of grief over her son." So when we think about women who had to see and experience their sons and daughters sold off to slavery, and then finding them and locating them after a long period of time, that's another story where we can see the son in this exchange. Pictures of the actual galleries where some photographs were made on the camps. And then another broadside by Frederick Douglass that I love so much, where he is challenging free men to join the war. And he says, "Are free men less brave than slaves?" And so here we appeal to you to join the fight. And this is another way of reading this experience of masculinity through this time period. Christian Fleetwood's diary, which is in the Library of Congress, and he writes, "Up at the break of dawn." He writes about the experience of the weather, what they ate over time period, meeting President Lincoln, and all of the other kind of soldiery experience over time period. But the careful narrative that he creates in the script of his writing, and also what it meant to be a soldier at the front. Sojourner Truth, a photograph here with her grandson, who was also a soldier with the 54th Mass. A photograph of him placed on her lap. So we began to see this metaphorical experience of a woman who was enslaved, who also battled that experience, but also kept a focus on freedom and had lectures and experienced that over time. And here we begin to see the importance of photography for a woman who was enslaved, who is free, whose grandson also fought the battle, but was also in prison in South Carolina during the war. And then ranges of images and backdrops were important. Images of sailors and soldiers. Journalists are also important at this time, Black journalists who are describing the war, describing the experience of the war, of the battles, and see the victories. Images that people leaving, Black families leaving plantations and taking the horses with them and broken down wagons, and what they were able to survive with. Images of pregnant women and younger children and older women, and described as contraband, that they were in this limbo state of between freedom and enslavement. And here we see a woman who takes her bonnet off in this image, where she wants to have her face shown. She wants the experience documented. And so we see it by she's holding a bonnet in her hand. There's an African-American hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. And here we see a number of people standing outside. Images that are central, as we know about this image of Gordon, who's also known as the Scourge Back, but we also see him as he enters camp. And, shoeless, ragged clothes, but also stylized in a sense, where his hat is used as protection, but also he poses with his hat. He poses in a posture of freedom. This is an image that was in Harper's Weekly that includes the drawing of him entering camp, the image that circulated over time, and then an image of him as a soldier, as a Union soldier, which we rarely see, and I have not had an opportunity to actually see that actual photograph. Hopefully we'll find it over time. Women who were mourning the loss of a husband or a child, and we see this in these images. So these are just central ways that I wanted to share moments of war, but moments of how images were preserved. And I'll end with an image of Robert Shaw, who led the 54th. And this is an album that's at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture that had some of the soldiers' images in a family album in memory of George Thompson Garrison. And the outside of the album, thought it was really important how white and Black families preserve memories of the war, such as Frederick Douglass's sons who joined the war. Frederick Douglass's, eventually it was his daughter-in-law, Amelia Logan, as she poses in upstate New York studio, but she was engaged to Lewis Douglass, who was a part of the discussion of war when he was, experience of war, where he was injured in Morris Island. And he writes about the experiences of the battles, and he writes a love letter to her. And so there's a sense of hope, and we see that these young soldiers and families believe that there was a future for Black people during this time period. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up for Makeda.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Thank you, Arnika, for organizing this. Thank you, Deb, for your wonderful presentation. It's always wonderful to share the space with you. And I'll just put a plug in now that Deb and I will be sharing the space again for the Photo Focus Biennial in the fall. Mark your calendars. I'm going to share today a project that I'm working on. Really, after kind of reading Visioning Emancipation years ago, I began to think about Civil War era labor and African American identity. This project is more broadly about African American labor in the 19th century, representations of African American labor and labor production. But the Civil War, of course, is a key moment to understand this. So the story kind of begins in May of 1861, when the Union seized the colonial era military installation Fortress Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. 3 fugitive slaves approached officials seeking to join the Union cause. Their owner's representative immediately attempted to reclaim the men, citing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. In a momentous and strategic move, Union Major General Benjamin Butler argued that since the slaves were property, they were therefore liable to confiscation by the laws of war. he declared, "I shall hold these Negroes as contraband of war." Butler did not return the slaves. He also did not free them. He put them to work, building fortifications around the town of Hampton. "I have a need for labor," he explained. Soon, hundreds of slaves were living in and around Fortress Monroe. Butler acknowledged later that, quote, "the men worked zealously and efficiently at building fortifications, saving our soldiers from that labor under the gleam of the midday sun. The women were earning substantially their own subsistence in washing, marketing, and taking care of the clothes of the soldiers, and rations were being served out to the men who worked for the support of the children." Now, politicians delayed outlining a definitive policy on the contrabands, as they came to be called, but Union officials continued to use Butler's term to designate slaves who had escaped or who were brought into Union lines. These contrabands lived in rural and urban settings, often in what became small villages on the outskirts of Union camps. Wartime deprivation impacted them as well as the general population. The camps endured shortages of food, clothing, housing, and medical supplies. Mortality rates among the contrabands were often high. Overcrowding and unsanitary conditions contributed to diseases in the camps, but labor was exhausting and the food was poor. Contraband camps were not exclusive to one region of the country and existed wherever the Union managed to advance. Now, soon after the events of Fortress Monroe, the contraband figure quickly becomes part of Northern popular culture. Anxious for stories to sustain readers, correspondents recognized the general interest in contrabands, as most Northern whites had never had any contact with slaves. A New York Times writer breathlessly described General George Stoneman's arrival in Virginia, where at a plantation after plantation, quote, "the Negroes at work in the fields, surprised by their coming, shouted for joy, flung high in the air their axes and hoes, loosed their masters' horses from plows, and followed the raiders in their bold ride for liberty." Now, illustrations and photographically based images of African-American contraband circulated broadly via photographic distributors and immensely popular illustrated journals. Photographic studios sold their own images, and sometimes illustrators used photographs as the basis for their drawings, as you see here. Others were produced for use in government reports or by the military. And so what you're seeing here is a very close collaboration between photographer Alfred Woad, who worked with David Woodbury. David Woodbury is working for Alexander Gardner. And it's important to understand how these images and how photographers were basically feeding kind of details to illustrators, but also how those illustrations sometimes can have, or often were very distorted in their representations. So it's really important to understand both the dialogue between photography and prints at this time. Now, the Northern public, which advocated for the Union's use of former slaves as laborers before the military officials did, and they understood the strategic stakes at the same time as they maintained their own prejudiced beliefs. If the Union did not accept these slaves fleeing the Confederacy, then the South gained an advantage by using slave labor, right, to sustain the home front and to support their army. For example, they could grow food while white men fought. Depriving the South of labor became a strategy, right? As one Union official wrote, quote, "It is the policy of the government to withdraw from the enemy as much productive labor as possible." Going away. At the same time, Northerners were anxious about the impact of an influx of Blacks on the labor market. What did it mean that a former slave was now free to labor? The rise of capitalism was already remaking the meaning of labor in America and thus community relations. To white workers of the urban North, free Black workers would only serve to further diminish their economic and thus their political standing. The potential of the free Black labor and gains in Black economic power was the underlying issue that culminated in the New York City draft riots during the summer of 1863. The fear evoked by the free Black labor and potentially the free Black citizen is evident in these kind of contradictory representations of contraband labor. So looking at here an image of a quartermaster's wharf and some workers. Here is one of these representations where you see the kind of anxieties about the free Black labor. So instead of showing these illustrations are showing really Blacks under the control of the Union Army. So you're emphasizing in these pictures how there's constantly under the direction, and They're presented as meek, they're presented as seeking of assistance, and really diminishing the labor that they are going to perform, that they did perform, and their kind of active participation in this effort. So more than contrabands, the compelling story of the muster, the service, and the sacrifices of African-American troops in the Civil War era capture the historical imagination. However, right, former slaves in non-combat roles, significantly women, also served the Army by performing heavy and skilled labor. And you see the kind of heavy labor here in George Inness's documentation of the Dutch Gap Canal. The labor contrabands performed proved invaluable to the Union Army and Navy, overwhelmed by the conflict's logistical demands, unprepared for protracted war, and ill-suited to combat the efforts across a wide and varied geography. African Americans held a variety of positions, including as general laborers, wagon masters, sappers, miners, wheelwrights, cooks, blacksmiths, surgeons, nurses, and teamsters. Women performed gun maintenance, they washed clothes, they cleaned canteens. They also performed a substantial amount of labor in the camps because most able-bodied men were performing hard labor elsewhere or served the Army. African-American women served as nurses in Army hospitals, that we've already seen, and which often required them to travel between locations. That was also another form of work. In more urban areas, contrabands aided the sanitary commissions as relief workers. So you see in someone like George Inness's carte de visite, how he's really kind of showing us the breadth of labor activity that's happening here, positioning all of these figures around this space at various perspectives, so that it's activating different areas of the composition. And these are all mostly African American workers. Some of them are soldiers, but this is an instance where you see both African Americans working in combat roles and non-combat roles, but serving together as workers. You see a nurse here, a carte de visite of a nurse who worked at the Chesapeake Hospital in Hampton. The Chesapeake Hospital had been a women's college before the war, and then it became a hospital. You see an image from an illustration of some women working as laundresses in camp. You see the group of nurses there, and then you see another kind of detail of another photograph of another group of relief workers for the Sanitary Commission. Now, I think what's important about something like this that we often overlook in Civil War era photography, we often think of these children as kind of props, but it's also important to understand that they were working. They were working in the camps as laborers as well. Even though they worked for the Union, contrabands did not necessarily encounter humane treatment, right? Different commanders had different views toward the African-American laborers. Many worked 10 hours a day or more. For their work, they generally received their pay late or mostly not at all. Observers recorded stories of men who worked for nearly a year and yet had received less than $1 in compensation. Wages in many areas were less than a third of that were paid to whites. Butler himself admitted that some of his workers waited for as long as 2 years to be compensated. And even though it was clear to some observers that former slaves lacked confidence in the promises of officials to pay, they kept working, right, believing that their labor benefited the Union cause. Now, General Butler, for example, may have asserted that contrabands had been, quote, deserted, thrown away, abandoned, like the wrecked vessel upon the ocean, unquote. But African Americans were not naive in their actions. The actions of the 3 Fortress Monroe men precipitated the influx of thousands of people into the field of war, and they're amounting to nearly 1 million by the war's end. And most of these people are going to be working as laborers in and around the camps. In addition to their Army work, they cared for young children, the elderly and infirm, family members who could not work. In an unusual and extraordinary document, the contrabands of Beaufort, North Carolina, calling themselves the undersigned colored citizens of the town of Beaufort, right, presented a petition in regards to their treatment for their labor. They wrote that without pay, and as a consequence of the system of forced labor that they called it forced labor, quote, they have no means of paying rents or otherwise providing for their families. They ended their petition by saying, quote, anything that can be done by you to relieve us from the burden which we are now laboring will be highly appreciated. And even though the celebrated contrabands of Fortress Monroe, they also received maltreatment. Less than a year after they first arrived, one observer looked at the situation in which they were living and called it contrabandism, and said that contrabandism was just another name for, quote, one of the worst forms of practical oppression. In other words, government slavery. Detail here of the men on the corner of that image of the Christian Commission. The hospital in Nashville that you also saw in Deb's presentation. Now, images of contraband labor provide documentation not only the contribution of African Americans to the war effort, but of their varied skills as artisans, craftsmen. In photographs, you will see contrabands posed on hilltops and alongside retaining walls and other structures. By reproducing the context, viewers are able to see the scale of the work that these men and women performed and the real conditions in which they lived and worked. As historical records, they reveal the participation of African American women whose experience is often overlooked. Former slaves understood the stakes of the conflict and their own power to direct its outcome through their labor, wrote Robert Houston of Arkansas, who worked as both a laborer and a soldier for the Union. Quote, when called upon, I went into the Union service very willingly. From my first information of the war, my actions and my feelings and sympathies have all the time been for the success and maintenance of the Union cause, and all the time willing and desirous to fight or to do anything else in my power in that behalf. Representations of contraband labor reference the American tradition of occupational portraits, from which African Americans were typically excluded. During the mid-19th century, Americans registered their occupational pride through images, mostly daguerreotypes, later tintypes. These images emerged out of a social and cultural climate in which manufacturing transformed the role of the artisan in society through the introduction of factory labor. So again, we can imagine the fear of the free Black labor. The factory labor system effectively dismantled the guild-like system that had previously made the artisan a celebrated figure. Photographic occupational portraits had their precedence in the fine art portraits and genre paintings. Right? For example, we see the 18th century painting by John Singleton Copley of the artist Paul Revere. And here's a kind of a version of an occupational portrait by James F. Gibson. But one of the things that we see, as I noted before, is a way in which the presence of the Union troops, right, still announce a kind of ownership of these people, right? They're actually not free as the other occupational portrait that you saw previously. And here to compare, you can see the way in which Gibson treats the African Americans in their laboring and versus the whites on the right, white men on the right, who are free to kind of adopt this labor identity. So there you're kind of seeing, enacting both of these, the tension of the potential of the free Black laboring body. We also have to think about the fact that many of the landscapes that we see are labor landscapes. They are landscapes that are evidence of this work of African American laborers and of their knowledge of the natural world, the way in which they understood how to source materials, the way in which they are drawing on their own craft traditions to contribute. On the right, you're seeing a boat, a Union hospital, upon which many African American women worked. Don't you think we colored people are entitled to some credit? Harriet Tubman asked in a piece in Boston's The Commonwealth, in which she described her work to help Blacks cross the Union lines. Despite coping with little medical care or shelter, or rarely receiving compensation for their work, African Americans still pledged their support to the Union cause. In addition to seeking compensation, the Beaufort colored citizens declared, quote, your petitioners desire to further express their entire willingness to contribute to the cause of the Union in any way consistent with their cause as free men and the rights of their families, unquote. Through their labor, these anonymous men and women insisted on a Black identity that ran counter to the images and beliefs of contemporary culture. In seeking to shape their public identity through their collective actions and their labor, they are forerunners in a legacy that continued into the 20th century. And I'll end by looking at a few photographs from an extraordinary album by Andrew Joseph Russell that he made before he worked on other projects. He's working on the United States Military Railroad in Northern Virginia, and he spends a lot of time showing us actually the work of the African American laborers. And I think I have one more image. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so
Right.
much. That was incredible. Deb, were you saying something? Please excuse me.
Just to say thank you. It was really great to see the work and the range of images, and then also the overlap of the concepts of what we're both experiencing about labor, and the images focusing on contraband. And I think that's really central. I love reading the chat too, that I see Professor William Sorrell is here, and he said the importance of the pension records and archives. And I was just curious with the way that you were able to enter into some of the narratives about the work. You know, rarely do we have people writing about labor. You know, and I think that's just a fascinating approach you have to the aspect of this experience. And I was curious, did you also use the pension record to document some of the labor of these people?
Yes. So mostly what I haven't used that kind of archival material yet, but I've been using kind of first person accounts of the work that enslaved people did, or formerly enslaved people did, because as you know, there was a large effort to interview former slaves about their experiences, and at the same time, there are published accounts of people at the time, like describing the kind of work that they did, nestled in between other kinds of discussions. You can find them saying, you know, this is the kind of work that I did. But certainly, what I've always appreciated about your work is bringing in the larger kind of visual culture and the kind of evidence of the voices of people experiencing this. So,
and then also, I love seeing the commission. I did not know about the commission. Was it South Carolina? Was that that one?
Yes, yeah, that was a South Carolina Christian Commission.
Right.
And I mean, previously, before reading, many years ago, before reading and visiting Emancipation, I mean, I would look at these images and just think, oh, you know, these are just kind of people on the sides and their props, but then to be inspired to think, well, what were their roles? And they weren't just there posing for the picture; they're actually playing a part in the work here.
Mm-hmm. So, do we have Nicholas Fahey saying thank you? I was curious, are any other questions from the people who are here today? 107 people. So there's one for you, Dr. Bess.
So it's this project, no, is not based on the Harvard archives. It's based on other public repositories, but not necessarily Harvard's exclusively. There are a few images.
Yes, we'll continue to monitor the chat to see if there are any questions from our guests. But I just wanted to add that your work is incredible. I was waiting with bated breath to hear you speak, and the level of detail in terms of the research is really commendable. Seeing occupational portraits, labor landscapes, and portraits of that era in American history was really gratifying for me. Here is one question. Can you speak about Black Confederate soldiers and their photos, Dr. Willis?
I did not include a lot of images on the Black Confederate, because some of them were, quote, soldiers, but were forced to be soldiers by their owners, because some of the images that we know of, that the sons of the slave owners would force their human property to fight for them. So that's another aspect of it. There's a image that I have in the book of one soldier that's in the, let's see, that's in the book where he, Silas Chandler, where he was enslaved and he decided to stay with his former owner to when he was injured and helped to take care of him when he was injured. So the aspect of there were Confederate Black soldiers, their status in terms of soldiering we can question, but many of them did not join freely. And I only have one in the book.
Here's another question. Both of you are active users of archives, but we know that marginalized people often don't figure in them. Have you found instances of archives made by and for Black people?
Well, the Schomburg Center is an archive that is about Black culture, and Arthur Schomburg made for the experience of telling the story. But I believe that there are private archives that were given to public repositories that we are discovering now. And people are actually going into their family archives and opening up. And we see a lot with the National African American Museum, History and Culture, because families are opening up their family archives, and they see the importance of having the archives in these public collections. I am excited about that aspect of it.
Deb, have you seen that have a big impact on your own work over the years, just having more access and having people probably contact you about works that they have? Has that opened up new ways of you thinking about this material, having that kind of access now?
Yes, it has. It makes it even more difficult because I wish I had an archive that I could open up and keep available, because there are so many people who believe that I have an archive that I could process, share, and distribute some of the work in different ways. So I really wish that I meet people, I would say at least once a week through letters or through emails to share the family collection. So that's important.
I'll also take on that question to suggest that I think that one of the inspiring things about having the kind of scholarship that you've done is to begin to look again at other works that we do have in our collections and think about them differently and tell them from different perspectives. And that's part of the reason why I showed those images of what I call like labor landscapes, right? They're not just stories about conflicts and what happened when so and so advanced or whatever. They're also documents of labor. They're documents of the knowledge that people apply to the space and to the task at hand. So I think it's also about reinterpreting from different perspectives the images that we do have as well.
Yeah, I think that's exciting too, because we see that there were first person narratives that were written in the newspapers, like the Christian Monitor. There's so many newspapers that published letters that were sent back by Black soldiers in their communities, such in Plymouth, Mass. That opportunity we rarely hear about. The exciting aspect for me with this research was also identifying and finding through the work of Jill Newmark, Black surgeons. I had no idea that that she documented 6 Black surgeons, but the works of Black nurses, like you shared that image. So the work continues because there are family collections, the unusual collection of the Oblate sisters in Maryland that has images of Black doctors. When we think about Howard University, when I think Allison Nordstrom asked that question about the Black archive, just to think about the Moreland Spingarn Center, another important collection that has tons of material that we need to unearth to bring forward.
Yeah, it strikes me as you're speaking and from Allison's comment that this is also really the story about archives, and about reinterpreting how we understand what archives are and where they're located, who has them, and what's important to preserve.
It's fascinating. Dr. Best, there's a question. Does your work and this project continue with occupational portraits after the Civil War era? And then there are a lot of questions on the archives.
Yeah. So it does continue through the end of the 19th century, but I don't look at occupational portraits after that. I mean, kind of influenced by the idea of the occupational portrait and its kind of legacy. But it's actually not so popular because of the ways in which labor really changes in America in the post Civil War era. So the influence of it, yes, but not the portraits so much themselves anymore. In my project.
Yeah. I think that's really important. That's what you just said. And then following with Jamel Shabaz's question of what do we do with family archives? Do we, we suggest that we give them to public repositories or keep them. And I am the one who believes that they should be given and protected in public repositories with a grant to have someone process the collections. Yes. And make sure the collections are noted and known into a larger public. And that's really important. If someone has the resources to give the collection to a repository, be insistent that they have it processed. And I think that's another important. And another question, I don't know if for both of us is Black soldiers, World War I and II. Yes. I know I worked with Bill Miles back in the 80s when he did the film Men of Bronze. And that was a fantastic project for World War I soldiers, a new generation of people straight out of college looking for stories about World War I soldiers, and yes. New movies were created. And I think that's another important project. But the aspect you introduced is occupation, that how many of these soldiers, because of their occupations, enslaved when they were enslaved and free, helped to maintain a community, build structures in free and newly built towns for Black people. So I think the work that you have introduced about occupation is a central way of how the archive and seeing the evidence of the work of these laborers are important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the World War I, there's an exhibit right now. Well, I think it's coming down, but it's at the National World War I Museum Memorial, and it's called Snapshots. And they have a few photographs and they're vernacular images, they're personal images. So that story is also there in these kind of personal images. Soldiers taking pictures of themselves, sending images back to their loved ones. But of course, what's fascinating is that at the time of the World War eras, Kodak didn't even market to African Americans. They're not even pictured in that marketing. But yet, of course, they're still using that technology. So there's certainly a story there about how those soldiers are recording themselves and their interactions with their loved one through photography.
Yes.
Such an impactful medium. You both mentioned photo focus. I'd love to know what you're working on next as we wrap up. Yes, tell us more about that.
Well, Cheryl Finley and I are I'm really happy to learn about the show that you're actually doing at the same time. And Cheryl Finley and I are working on a show, of course, about the archive, and it's artists free to create work about what it means to be free. And so we have 20 artists in the exhibition. Its Photo Focus opens in Cincinnati in late September and will run for about 3 to 6 months. And we invited a range of artists to think and rethink the archives. They're already working in the archives, looking at from monuments to historical sites to family collections, and then honoring individuals such as Frederick Douglass and like, Harriet Tubman can go through a range, but also honoring the aspect of the Underground Railroad. So we have a range of artists in the show. We have, as I mentioned, 20 contemporary. Makeda.
Yeah, so as part of the Photo Focus Biennial, I'm co-curating an exhibition with the artistic director, Kevin Moore, and it's called On the Line, Documents of Risk and Faith. And it looks at, it's really inspired actually by David Hammonds's photograph of, Dawood Bey's photograph of David Hammonds's snowball sail. And it thinks about photography, performance, but also social justice issues, environmental justice issues. So it's about that line, the line between photography and performance, but also the body at risk, society at risk, but also in the document, with the will to document that, and the faith as well. So there's a range of photographers, video artists. It's a really interesting exhibition that I think will create new kind of conversations around what is documentary, and what does it mean to, what is performance, and what is a kind of interaction between photography and performance. And if you have never been to Cincinnati, it's a wonderful place to experience photography, and Photo Focus is doing amazing work.
Yeah,
and then
just
also
to give you the correct title. Sorry, when you said your title, I was like, oh yes, my correct title is Free as They Want to Be, Artists Committed to Memory.
and Deb and I will also be at Dartmouth in May, and we are speaking at the what is it? There's a conference. It's called I should have written it down, but we're speaking at a conference in May 5th, May 6th May 5th at Dartmouth. Photography's Afterlives. Photography's Afterlives. Yes.
This is amazing. There are a few more questions that have come in, but I know for respect of everyone's time, I know Dr. Willis and Dr. Best have other commitments. Builder Levy sends congratulations of inspirational presentation. There were questions about the Allen Farm. There were questions about the relationship between photographer and the subject and circumstances that surround each portrait in the field or in the studio. I mean, this is a topic that we could extend on a little further, but I apologize that we've kind of run out of time and wanted to respect everyone else's time, and thank all of the participants for your great questions, for participating today. Thank you, Dr. Willis. Thank you, Dr. Best, for joining us. This was incredible. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful day, and just thank you on behalf of APAT.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.